The storm had been screaming for 11 hours straight. Down here, it was only a heartbeat. A dull, muffled pounding somewhere overhead, like a fist on a far door. A man lay under the prairie in a hollow of snow no bigger than himself. The mouth of it was plugged with a canvas mail sack. His breath had glazed the walls into a thin shell of ice, and inside that shell, with 30 below zero a foot above his face, it was almost warm. His name was Walter Boone. He carried the mail, and he was fighting the hardest fight of his 54 years. He was fighting sleep, because sleep, on this night, in this snow, had another name. Understand this, he was not trapped. No bank had slid down on him, no drift had caught him unawares. Every pound of snow above his chest lay exactly where he had put it. Buried alive at 30 below, the mail carrier had stopped digging out and started digging deeper.
To understand why a sane man does such a thing, you have to go 12 hours back, to the morning of January 12, 1888. A morning so warm, so gentle, so much like April, that across 300 miles of prairie, the children walked to school without their coats. By nightfall, the day would have a name in the history books. They would call it the Children's Blizzard, and Walter Boone would be under the snow. The morning of January 12th came to Ashford, Dakota territory like a pardon. For 5 weeks, the cold had sat on the plains and refused to move. 30 below some mornings, colder on others, cold enough to pop the nails in the siding like pistol shots. And in the night, without asking anyone, the wind swung around to the south, and by sunrise, the eaves were dripping. Men crossed to the livery in shirt sleeves. Storekeepers propped their doors open to let the season in. After 5 weeks in a frozen fist, the whole town stood in the street with its face turned up to the sun. Accounts from the period describe the same detail over and over, from Dakota down through Nebraska. How kind that morning felt, and how nobody, not the farmers, not the station agents, not the old men who had read that sky their whole lives, smelled the trap. Walter Boone had carried the mail out of Ashford for 21 years. A star route, 26 miles of section roads and fence corners, out past the school and the creek to the last homesteads and around. He was 54 years old, a widower, a big-handed, deliberate man who sorted letters by feel with his eyes on the window. He counted things: steps, fence posts, telegraph poles, the miles between farms. Not because he had to, because a route is easier to trust when you know its numbers. In 21 years, he had not missed a day. Ask anyone in Ashford who Walter Boone was, and they would not give you a name. They would say, the mail. He was loading the cutter when Doc Ferris came across the street carrying a parcel the size of a hymn book. Inside it, wrapped in wool, was a bottle. The Holland baby, out at the far end of Walter's route, had lung fever. Had it bad, the doctor said, bad enough to count the hours. And the medicine had to be at the Holland place before tonight. Not tomorrow with the regular round, tonight. Walter asked no questions. He slid the bottle inside his coat, against his shirt, where his own heat would keep it from freezing, and took out his watch. 10 minutes past 8, 20 miles to the Holland windmill. On a morning like this one, he would be there by the middle of the afternoon, and home for supper. That was the whole plan. It lasted 4 hours. At the edge of town, he clicked Duke into a trot and ran the route through his head the way other men run a prayer. Danner's at mile 8, Hagen's at 11, the bridge over Elm Creek. Jorgensen's on the Creek Road, the Soderberg corner. And at the end of everything, under its windmill, the Holland homestead. 21 years. He could have driven it blind. Before the day was over, he would have to. Through the first miles, something was wrong with the morning, and he could not put a name on it. The air was too still. The sparrows had gone out of the fence rows. The sun wore a pale ring, and the light had gone flat and white at the edges of the sky. Walter marked it the way he marked everything on his route, filed it, and drove on. The sky had bluffed him before. The sky bluffed every winter, and the schedule was the schedule. At 10:30, he passed the schoolhouse at the crossroads. The children were out in the yard for recess, bareheaded, half of them, Their coats left home on the pegs because the morning had told them a coat was foolish. Miss Colby stood in the doorway with her shawl hanging open. Walter raised a hand off the lines, and a dozen small arms came up in answer, and he trotted on past with the sound of them fading behind him. He would think of that yard again before dark. At Danner's, he handed the mail through the kitchen door, and Mrs. Danner poured him a coffee he drank standing up. She was the one who tipped her chin at the north window. Out along the horizon, laid flat on the ground from edge to edge, was a wall. Gray going to black at the base, clean-edged as a plank, and it did not sit still. You could stand at the glass and watch it eat the line of the sky. She said she did not like the look of it, and she said it quietly, the way you speak when you don't want the thing to hear you. Old Danner, by the stove, was not troubled. A black norther in January was old news to a man his age, and he told, for perhaps the 100th time in his life, the story of the winter of '82. How a bunch of his cattle had drifted ahead of a storm, gone down into a coulee, and the snow had buried them past the horns. 3 days. His boys dug into the drift expecting frozen beef, and the cattle came up out of that snow alive. Steaming, the old man said. Steaming like kettles, every one. Snow is the earth's wool, said old Danner. Coldest thing on the prairie, and the warmest thing on it, depending which side of it you happen to be standing. Walter heard the story the way a man hears a story he has heard before. Eyes on the window, hand around the cup, mind already 3 miles down the road. If you had asked him an hour later what the old man had talked about, he would have told you he had no idea. 12 hours later, in the dark, under the prairie, he would remember every word. On Danner's porch, he weighed the day. The wall to the northwest, the bridge 5 miles on. The watch in his palm said 1/4 to noon. Behind him was a warm kitchen, and no shame in it. Half the county chose a stove that afternoon, and the county never blamed them. Ahead of him, Hagen's, before the wall came on. Likely the bridge, too. He had run ahead of weather his whole life, and against his shirt, wrapped in wool, a bottle was keeping time for a child at the end of the route. He snapped the watch shut, turned Duke out of Danner's lane, and drove straight at the wall. Of all the mistakes made on the plains that day, and by noon the prairie was full of them, Walter Boone's was the most ordinary one. He looked at the fastest storm in living memory, and he gave it the respect he would give a bad afternoon. The wall came on at 40 miles an hour, and at 20 minutes to 1 it arrived. Afterward, the people who lived through it kept reaching for the same words. It did not come on like weather, they said. It came on like something let out of a gate. Walter was 2 miles past Danner's in open country when the sound arrived ahead of the storm. A low roar out of the northwest, swelling, the voice of a freight train crossing a trestle where no trestle stood. He had time to stand up in the cutter. He had time to watch the wall lean over the last rise and take the fence lines one by one, a boiling gray-black face dragging a skirt of snow. He had time for one clear, useless thought. Too fast. Then the day turned off. Not darkened, turned off, the way a hand shuts a lamp. One breath, the section line ran out ahead of him, plain as print. The next, the world was a white room with walls he could touch. The snow was not falling. It was traveling, flat and hard, fine as flour, ground to powder by 300 miles of running start. It packed his nostrils. It sifted through the weave of his muffler. It found the gap between collar and cap the way water finds a crack. And behind the snow came the cold. The warm south wind was gone, as though it had never lived. What took its place came down degree by degree, without hurry and without end. In the first hour behind the front, the air lost 18 degrees. In the hour after, it kept going. Walter felt his beard stiffen, felt it freeze to the muffler in a single crusted piece, felt the first deep ache settle into his cheekbones. Duke had stopped trotting. The horse leaned his whole body sideways into the wind, walking half-turned, the way a man wades a river. Track, Walter was still saying in his head. Hold the track.
And on that word, the left runner bit into something, and the cutter lurched, and the sound under the iron was not the packed squeal of road. It was sod. Frozen prairie sod. He reined in and sat absolutely still, and worked it like a sum he did not want the answer to. He was off the road, and, this was the part with teeth in it, he could not say when he had left it. A minute back? 10?
The road lay 30 feet to one side of him, or half a mile, and in that white it made no difference at all. 30 feet was as gone as a mile. He got down. He wrapped the lines around his forearm, went to his knees in the running snow, and dug. Mittens flat, sweeping side to side, hunting the twin ruts he had followed for 21 years. His hands found grass, flattened, frozen prairie grass. He crawled left and dug. Grass. Right. Grass. The wind screamed over his bent back, and somewhere under it, Duke stood iced and shuddering, and Walter Boone knelt in the middle of a county he knew by heart, without one fact left to his name. The fear, when it came, was not the crashing kind. It was small and cold and exact, like the first symptom of something. It did not shout. It sat down beside him and waited. Every old hand on the plains preached the same sermon for a blow like this. Stay with the rig. Get into the lee of it, wrap the robes, let the horse stand, and wait it out. The ones who died were nearly always the ones who walked. Walter knew the sermon. He had preached it himself, to greener men than he was. But against his shirt, riding his own heartbeat, was a bottle wrapped in wool. Waiting it out meant waiting it out. 8 hours, 12, 20. The Holland baby did not have that kind of night in it. So, not lost, then. He would not permit lost. Lost was a word for men with no numbers in their hands, and Walter Boone was kneeling in the middle of the one county on earth he had by heart. Think. The counting habit, the useless 21-year habit, stood up in him and presented its bill of particulars. Danner's west fence, cedar posts. It ran off the road at the low corner and climbed crosswind to the section line, and he had counted those posts from the cutter's seat 1,000 times the way another man taps a hymn on his knee. He did not need to see the road. He needed to hit a straight thing that touched the road, and there was one, and it was long, and it was somewhere to his left. He led Duke crosswind, counting steps out loud into the muffler, not because the number mattered, but because a voice, even his own, even swallowed whole by the wind, kept the fear in its chair. At 61 steps, his mitten struck wire. He could have wept. He did something better. He took hold. Hand over hand, post to post, the rein looped on his arm and the cutter grinding behind, Walter walked the fence. The barbs chewed through the mitten's palm, and he let them. In a world scrubbed clean of every fact he had, each cedar post came up out of the white like a thing sworn to in court. 11 posts, 20, 34. The wire dipped and rose. Somewhere off his shoulder the storm went on erasing the county, but the county had a spine now, and he had his hand on it. At post 106, a smear of orange swam up in the white. A window, a lamp. The Hagen place. The kitchen heat hit him like a wall of its own. His face burned, his beard began to drip, and for a moment the room swayed. Mrs. Hagen already had a chair out and was working at his frozen muffler with both hands, saying what everyone in that kitchen already knew. That nobody goes back into that. That mail was mail, but this was the other thing. That men had died within a rod of their own barns in blows like this one, and every soul on the prairie knew the stories, and the stories were true. The window glass shuddered in its putty while she said it. Hagen himself, a fair man, said the sensible version. Storms wear out. Stay the night. The route would keep till morning. Walter did not argue with any of it, because all of it was right. He took the parcel out of his coat instead and set it on the oilcloth and let it do the talking. A bottle, wrapped in wool, still carrying the warmth of his own body.
"The Holland baby," he said. "Lung fever." Doc Ferris had counted the hours out loud that morning, and the count ran out tonight. The kitchen went quiet, the way kitchens do when the thing on the table is bigger than the storm outside. Every word said in that kitchen was true. The bottle was truer. Mrs. Hagan looked at the bottle for a long moment and stopped pulling at his muffler and began instead to wrap it tighter. She filled him with hot coffee. She forced dry socks on him and a second pair of mittens, and she did it all angrily, the way a woman does when she has lost an argument to something she cannot even shout at. At 2:15, Walter Boone stood on the Hagan porch with his hand on the latch. 9 miles to the Holland windmill. The gray light already going, the mercury with 30 more degrees left to fall, and everything the Hagans had said about the storm still standing. Every word of it true. He opened the door, and the cold took his breath the way a river takes it. The latch clicked shut behind him. From the Hagen gate, the route ran east along the section road, and at the second corner it met the problem of Elm Creek. The creek cut deep through that country, a crooked trench of cut banks and brush, and the road respected it. It swung a long dogleg north, a mile and better out of the way, to cross at the plank bridge where the banks laid down. On a decent day, the dogleg cost 40 minutes, and nobody begrudged them. This was not a decent day, and Walter stood at the fork and did what he had done all his life. He counted. The dogleg, with Duke reduced to a wading walk and the drifts building in every cut, 2 hours, likely more. Straight across at the old ford below the bend, half a mile. The creek had been frozen to its gravel for 5 weeks. A January like that one builds bridges of its own, and every winter men crossed on the ice to steal the dogleg. It was one of the small liberties the country allowed. He had taken it himself, twice since Christmas. 2 hours of daylight bought for half a mile of ice. There was no version of him on that afternoon with that bottle against his shirt, choosing the dogleg. Duke said no. At the lip of the draw, the horse planted all 4 feet and shut the argument off. Ears flat, neck bowed, hindquarters swung sideways. The whole animal turned into one word. Walter clucked to him, slapped the lines. The horse that had leaned into a killing wind all afternoon without a single complaint stood at that smooth white slope and refused it with his body. The old teamsters had a saying about moments like this one, and the saying was that on bad ground, the horse is the better judge. Walter knew the saying. He also knew the snow ahead lay firm and wind-packed, and the light was going, and the hours were spending themselves whether he moved or not. So he got down and took the bridle and led, because a horse that will not be driven onto bad ground can often be led onto it out of trust, which says something about horses and something worse about men. 10 feet out, the world gave way. What had read as drifted meadow was a roof. The blow had bridged the creek channel over with a crust of driven snow, blind and clean, and the crust that carried a walking man refused the horse behind him. Duke went through to the chest in one lurch, into the channel, into the dark air under the snow, and the cutter came down after him. A shaft snapped with a crack like green wood. The rig slewed, dove nose first, and wedged. The minutes after that Walter could never afterward put in order. There was the horse screaming, a sound with iron in it, a sound nothing on a route of 21 years had ever made at him, and hooves going through crust, and the wind over it all like a lid clamped down. He remembered his knife. Buckles frozen into lumps of ice would not give, and he cut what would not give. Good leather, months of wages, gone, without one thought spent on it. He remembered hauling at the bridle with both hands, the horse lunging, failing, lunging, and on the third try Duke heaved out of the creek and stood shaking in the wind, holding his off foreleg wrong. Lame. Not broken. Walter ran his hand down the leg and the horse allowed it. But done. Done carrying, done pulling, done saving anybody. In the lee of the wrecked cutter, Walter took stock out loud, the wind eating the words off his lips as fast as he made them. The bottle, dry, warm, riding against his shirt. The match tin. The jackknife. The canvas sack, empty now, which he slung across his body without yet knowing why. and under the cutter seat, lashed and dry, the letter mail. 21 years, said the mail goes where the carrier goes. That was the whole of the catechism, the entire faith.
He tightened the lashings instead, folded the wrecked robes over the sack, and left it. He said it out loud, into the wind, like a promise. He would come back for it. Of everything the day had done to him so far, that was the first thing that felt like breaking. Then, before the leaving, the chore that mattered more than the leaving. He was snowed to the waist, down the boots, up the sleeves, packed along every seam. And here the country's oldest winter lesson stood up. Snow this cold is dry. It does not wet a man. His own heat wets it, and wet, out here, is not a discomfort, but a sentence. So he beat himself clean like a rug on a line, wool scoured with the flat of the mitten, sleeves scraped, collar dug out. He sat in the lee of the cutter, bared each foot in turn to the murdering air, 30 seconds of courage afoot, shook the boots empty, and put on the dry socks Mrs. Hagen had forced into his pockets an hour and a lifetime ago. Cold is only cold, his father used to say. Wet is over. He came up the creek road toward Jorgensen's, leading a lame horse, half a mile at a pace that made his whole body howl to go faster. He would not go faster. Hurry makes sweat, and sweat is water, and water was over. He walked slow and even, like a man behind a plow, and made the half-mile last 20 minutes, and hated every one of them. Jorgensen's barn rose out of the gray like a ship's hull, and the old man was in it, doing evening chores at 4 in the afternoon, because in that dark there was no other time to do them. He was 70-odd, and alone, and Norwegian, and he took one long yellow lantern look at what the storm had brought him. A lame horse, no rig, a mail carrier crusted white to the eyebrows, and he swore, quietly and thoroughly, in 2 languages. He stabled Duke with his own hands, rubbed the leg, blanketed him, and while he worked, he laid out, in that patient, sing-song English, precisely what the remaining 6 miles were. Suicide, walked slowly. Men died in their own yards. Men died between the house and the barn, which was why God gave Norwegians rope to string between the two. And here stood a man proposing 6 open miles, at night, into the teeth of it, on foot. Walter, hands wrapped around the mug the old man had filled without asking, told him about the bottle. The Holland place, lung fever, and a doctor counting hours, and the count running out tonight. The old man was quiet for a while. The barn ticked and boomed around them. Then he did the 2 things Walter would carry the rest of the way. He took down his barn lantern, squat, iron-framed, ugly, with a door that shut tight over the flame, filled it, lit it, and put it in Walter's hand, as if handing over a grandchild. And he gave him the bearing, the one piece of navigation the night had left. The wind. It had settled since the front, he said, blowing steady now, out of the northwest, true as a nail. Hold it on the right cheekbone. Hold it there and walk, and it would carry a man to the Soderberg corner, and from the corner, the telegraph poles ran the line road straight to Holland's Gate. Keep the wind on your right cheek, the old man said, and count your poles, and don't you sit down. Not once, not for a minute. At 4 o'clock, Walter Boone went out of the barn's yellow warmth into the last of the daylight, such as it was, a gray-blue dishwater light already curdling toward dark. 6 miles. A lantern in his fist, a bottle against his heart, the wind set hard against his right cheek. The shortcut across the creek had been meant to buy him an hour. It had cost him the horse, the cutter, the mail, and the middle of the afternoon. The storm did not sell hours, it only bought them. He had an hour of gray left, maybe less, and 2 miles to the Soderberg corner. He walked them the way he had walked the creek road, slow, even, the wind held hard on his right cheekbone. He counted his steps, and he counted the minutes of light, and both counts came out thin. The sound came from his left, downwind, thin, human, gone. He stopped. In a blow like that one, the ears lie. The prairie was full of voices that night that were only wire and wind, and every man who chased one risked joining it.
He stood, and the light spent itself while he stood, and he told himself it was wind. It came again. It was not wind. Leaving the bearing was a decision, and he made it like one. He faced the wind square, fixed its angle in his bones, and turned left, counting his steps out loud so the count could walk him back. 60, 80. At 91, shapes. 2 children, in the open, in the dark, coming down. A girl, 9 or so, on her feet because she had her brother under the arms and would not let him settle.
The boy was 6, and he was done. Face slack, eyes going long and slow. On the prairie, you learned what sleepy meant, out in the cold, before you learned your letters. The girl talked in pieces, through a scarf frozen to her mouth. The school. The teacher had sent them home at the storm's first sign, to run ahead of it. They had run. The white had eaten the lane, and their farm might as well have been in another country. 2 children from the morning schoolyard, 2 of the small arms that had gone up when he waved. The Soderberg house stood half a mile from the corner, half a mile up its own lane, upwind, uphill. A mile there and back if the going was clean, and the going was not clean. A mile of the baby's hours. The last of the light thrown in. Walter stood over the boy and made the coldest count of his life. The Holland baby had hours. A doctor had counted them, and doctors count carefully. These 2 had minutes, and the storm was counting those. There was a version of it where he pointed the girl up the lane and walked on. He looked at that version once, straight, the way you look at a wound. The girl was 40 pounds of spent courage. The drifts on that lane would take her to the waist. That version ended with 3 dead children instead of none, and one of them still buttoned to a bottle. He knelt, opened his coat, and put the boy inside it, against his chest, against the bottle, 2 lives buttoned into one coat. He hung the canvas sack crossbody, put the girl's fist through the strap, and gave her the only job on earth. Hold that and count. The lane was the worst half-mile of the day. Upwind meant leaning into the blow with a child on his chest, breath torn away at the lip, drifts to the knee, to the thigh. The girl hauled on the strap behind him. Her voice came up through the wind in a thread. 9, 10, 11, and every number was one more step she had not lain down in. At 40-some, the field took him. A plow furrow drifted blind, deep as a grave lip. His boot found the far side of it, and nothing else did. He turned as he fell, took the ground on his shoulder to spare the boy, and Jorgensen's lantern swung wide on his fist and came down on the one stone in that county. The iron held. The glass did not. The flame was gone before he stopped sliding. He lay one breath in the snow, boy tight against him, and let the loss register the way he had learned to let things register that day. Fully, once, and no second time. No light now. None to carry. The night had collected early. Up. Count. The girl's voice behind him, torn thin. He made her start over at 1, louder, and matched his steps to her numbers. It kept her awake. It kept his line honest. A man drifting off course does it in silence. A man walking to a child's count answers to it, step for step, like a horse to a rein. Light in a window. Then the window, then the door. The Soderbergs took the children the way you take things out of a fire. Mrs. Soderberg had the boy stripped and wrapped and against her own skin before her husband had the door braced shut, and when the boy began to cry, thin and furious, feeling coming home with its needles, she laughed out loud at the sound. Crying was living. Everyone in that kitchen knew the price of the other kind of quiet. Then came the second asking. It was night now, true night, and the sensible words had all been used up at Hagen's, so Mrs. Soderberg used none. She stood between him and the door and looked at him the way you look at a man you have decided to remember. Walter did not cross the threshold, and would not. A chair, a stove, 10 minutes, he knew now exactly what they cost, and he could not pay it. He stood in the doorway with the cold at his back and asked Soderberg for one thing. The wind. Had it held? Soderbergh listened at the gable like a man taking a pulse and said it had. Northwest, steady, true. Steady, Walter thought. True. 3 miles of pole line between him and the Holland windmill, and a bearing he could trust. He stepped back off the porch at 6:30. 3 times that day the storm had asked him to stop, and 3 times going on had been the right answer. The fence had been right. The creek, even the creek he had survived. The children were alive behind a braced door because a stubborn man had refused, twice, to be sensible. He walked into the dark, sure of the 4th time. That is how a night baits its trap. The Soderbergh corner gave him the poles. They came up out of the dark one at a time. Telegraph poles down the line road, set, he knew this the way he knew his own birthday, 220 of his steps apart. 30 poles, give or take, to the Holland gate. He put his mitten on the first one the way you shake a hand. The method was simple, and it was his whole estate. Wind hard on the right cheekbone, 220, counted aloud, and a pole at the end of the count. It was not hope. It was better than hope. It was procedure. Pole, pole, pole. His voice ran in the muffler, cracked and steady, and at the end of every count, the dark grew a post. The first sums of the night that came out even, one after another, after another. Somewhere ahead, a lamp was burning in the Holland window, and every 220 brought it closer. And into the rhythm, unnoticed, crept the most dangerous cargo a man can carry across ice. Certainty. What he could not know was this: a turning wind does not announce itself. Behind the front's back edge, up in the dark, the flow had begun to swing. 1 point south, then 2. Same scream, same iron cold on the same cheekbone, but the compass underneath it had rotated, and the rule he was walking by had quietly stopped being true. He held his angle exactly, faithfully, mile after mile, and faithfulness itself walked him off the road in a long, blind arc. He did everything right. That was the trap's whole design. 220 came, and no pole. He held still, gave it 10 more steps. Poles lean, drifts build, a count can run a little long. 240, 260, 300. He stood in the screaming dark with a number in his mouth and no place to put it. He checked the wind, square on the right cheekbone, right where the rule wanted it. He walked on. Nothing. The poles were gone, and by everything he trusted, they could not be gone. He turned crosswind to hunt a line, and found tracks. Boot prints, half-filled, walking away confident and even. He knelt and got his mitten down into one and felt out the heel of it. His boot. His heel. His even, confident, doomed stride. He was circling. He had been circling for some time. The wind lay on his cheek exactly as promised, and the wind had been lying for an hour. He counted what he had left, because counting was the one thing still working. Hands, past hurting, gone to wood. Face, absent without leave. Feet, reporting, but late. Matches, useless in a wind that ate flame. Position, unknown, a quarter mile from the road or 2 miles into open section, and no way on earth to tell. Against all that, the one number that mattered. More miles left than there was blood to walk them. And the mercury still going down. It had 30 degrees of night ahead of it, and no reason to hurry. Then the voice came, the one he had been warned about his whole life, and it was not a scream and not a temptation. It was reasonable. "Sit down a minute," it said, "just to breathe. Just 1 minute off your feet, and then we'll go on." It was, he understood, the exact voice the Lindqvist boy had been listening to when Walter found him. And against it, quiet, with 9 winters of grave dirt between them, came Mary's. Not a ghost, he had no use for ghosts, a memory with sense in it. In their whole life she had never once asked him to skip a route, and she had never once asked him to die on one. There it was then, out in the open, the question the whole night had been walking him toward.
Going on meant dying on his feet inside the hour, upright and faithful and stupid. Sitting down meant the boy's sleep. Both roads went into the same snow. His knee found the third answer before his head did. Wire. A fence, the day's oldest friend, arriving one last time. He went along it hand over hand, one post, two, to a corner post set in a brace, and behind the corner, built by the wind since noon, stood a drift. A ridge of it, long and packed and shoulder-high, hard as a hayrick under his fist.
And out of a warm kitchen that was that same morning and also 100 years gone, old Danner's voice arrived, complete. The cattle of 82 drifted over, buried 3 days, up out of the snow, alive and steaming. Snow is the earth's wool, the old man said, and Walter had not listened, and the words had ridden along with the bottle all day, waiting for the hour. He stood before the drift and made the choice with everything named and nothing hidden. What he was refusing? The march. 21 years of it, the whole religion of forward, the belief that a route is a thing you finish on your feet. What it cost? Hours off the bottle's count, spent lying still in the dark while a baby breathed against the far end of them. What every walking bone in his body called it. Quitting. Digging your own grave and climbing in. What Mary's sense called it. The route. With the last mile of it going down instead of forward. He dug, knife first, then hands, cutting into the leeward face, low, keeping the mouth small. The packed snow came away in slabs. He hollowed up and in, a space the size of himself and no bigger, because a small hole is a warm hole. And he worked slow, on his knees, sweat discipline, holding even here, even now. Then he backed in, feet first, and pulled the canvas mail sack into the mouth behind him and packed it tight. 21 years of carrying letters, and the sack's last duty was to be a door. He left a fist of space at its edge for air, and the storm went away. Not gone, overhead. The scream dropped to a heartbeat, a dull pounding somewhere above, a fist on a far door. The cold inside stood still, vicious but honest, and the air his body paid to warm stayed bought. Outside, 3 feet away, the night was falling toward the coldest hours the plains had seen in years. Inside was him, the bottle against his chest, and the dark. 2 jobs now, and he said them aloud to hear a voice. Keep the bottle warm. Keep the eyes open. He worked his toes to a count of 100, then the fingers, then the toes again. And between the counts he said the route. Danner's at mile 8, Hagen's at 11, the bridge, Jorgensen's, the corner. Every farm, every gate, the name of every dog on 26 miles, in order, like a rosary. And he made the night one promise, and nailed it where he could see it. The first lull, the first true drop of the wind. He moves. Not a minute later. 20 minutes to midnight. A man under the prairie, breathing in a hollow the size of himself, a mail sack for a door, fighting sleep. Because sleep, down here, had another name. 12 hours ago, the children had walked to school without their coats. The mercury had 5 more hours of falling to do. He began to count. The hours between midnight and 5 were the longest of Walter Boone's life, and the emptiest. There was no storm left to fight. The whole war had shrunk to the width of 2 eyelids. He worked the toes. He worked the fingers. He said the dogs. And once, somewhere in the 4th hour, he caught himself at Danner's stove with a cup in his hand, the kitchen warm, the morning kind, and he came up out of it the way a drowning man comes up, because he had been warned about this too. The dreams of warmth are the door out, and it only opens one way. He bit his cracked lip until it spoke to him and started the dogs over from the first farm. Then the fist on the far door stopped knocking. He heard the lull the way you hear a clock stop, by the hole it left. The pounding overhead thinned, stumbled, and quit, and a silence came down that his ears kept refusing, roaring on their own for a minute into the quiet. Every safe instinct in him said, wait. Daylight was an hour off, maybe two. The hole had kept him alive. The cold out there now, windless, was the deepest of the entire night. But the promise was nailed up where he had left it. The first true lull, he moves. Not a minute later. He drove his shoulder through the crust and climbed up out of the prairie. The world stood swept and still. The sky had emptied itself to the snow line, stars all the way down, and the cold was a motionless, honest, murdering cold. The worst hour of the storm, and the safest, because for the first time since noon, a man could see. And there, east and a little south, black against the first gray watering of the sky, stood a skeleton he knew. The Holland windmill, under a mile off. The night's blind arc had dropped him almost at the gate. All those hours, the lamp had been burning just past the reach of his ruined count, and if he had kept walking his faithful circles, they would have found him in the spring, within sight of it. He walked the last mile on feet he could hear but not feel, eyes on the windmill, and let it grow. The lamp in the window was still lit. It had been lit all night. At the door he raised his hand to knock, and the hand would not make a fist. He struck the door with his forearm, twice, and then with his shoulder, and stood swaying in the blue dark, listening to the lamp come near. The door opened, and the heat rolled over him, and he stayed on his feet because falling would have been a discourtesy. His fingers could not manage the buttons. Mrs. Holland undid his coat for him, both her hands shaking worse than his. And out of it, from against his shirt, wrapped in wool and 11 hours of one man's warmth, came the bottle, still warm. Behind her, from the back room, thin and furious, a baby was crying. Crying was living. He had learned that at the Soderbergs. The mail was late, Walter said. First time in 21 years. Then a chair caught him, and the kitchen went soft at the edges, and the Holland's hired man was already pulling on boots to break trail for the doctor. The thawing in the days after was worse than the freezing. Feeling came home with needles first, and then with fire, and it collected its toll. When the roads opened, Doc Ferris took the tips of 2 fingers from Walter's right hand and 1 toe and said what there was to say, that against that night it was a price a man paid smiling. For the rest of his life, Walter Boone carried the mail with a changed grip. Nobody ever heard him call it a bad bargain. Duke wintered in Jorgensen's barn and pulled a cutter again by spring. The Linkvist children went home to their own farm 2 days later when their father came across the section on snowshoes. And the letter mail came in too. The first day the creek road would carry a sledge, Walter went back for the wrecked cutter and dug his sacks out from under the robes. Every letter delivered. 11 days lay, and he apologized for it at every door. The 13th of January came up clear over the plains, and with the light came the count. Accounts from the period put the dead in the hundreds across Dakota and Nebraska, and so many of them were children caught between the schoolhouse and home that the storm took its name from them. The reports agree on one detail, told over and over, farm after farm, how close so many of them were found to shelter, a few hundred yards, a fence line away, within sight of a window with a lamp in it. They were the ones who kept walking, or the ones who sat down. All that morning, men with scoop shovels dug into drifts along the fence lines of 2 territories, looking for neighbors. In one drift, at one fence corner, there was nobody to dig for. The man who had gone into it had already come out on his own and was asleep beside a stove with his hands wrapped in goose grease, a delivered bottle standing empty on the table. He had not outwalked the storm, he had not outlasted it, and he had certainly not beaten it. He had been saved by a fence he had counted for 21 years, by a habit of numbers his neighbors teased him for, by a pair of socks forced on him in an angry kitchen, and by a story told at a stove by an old man everyone had stopped listening to years ago. And by one thing more, the thing under all the others, by knowing, 1 hour before it killed him, which man the night was asking him to be. The one who pushes on, or the one who stops. 21 years of pushing on had gotten the bottle to the fence corner. One act of stopping got it to the door. The thaw came at the end of March. The great drift at the fence corner went down slow. the way big drifts do. And by May, it was a green shoulder of grass with a fence running over it, and nothing about it said that a man had lived inside it for 6 hours one January night. Walter drove past it twice a week, out and back, for 11 more years. Once, the first spring, he stopped the new cutter, walked over, and put his right hand, the one with the new grip, on the corner post, the way you shake a hand. The people of that county told his story for 50 years, and they never needed more than one sentence to start it. Buried alive at 30 below, the mail carrier stopped digging out and started digging deeper.